So again, I'm just going to explain what we're actually going to cover today. So we're going to talk about how to interpret questions, how to properly get all of the information from the way that the question is phrased. Super important. We're going to talk about how to plan your answers. And we're also going to really go through the examples of command words, which is also key to be able to interpret the question. We're also going to review some sort of exam wisdom from sort of collective experience of educators, but also from examiners. So we're going to do the last thing first, actually. So examiners, in case you don't know, they generate sort of quite detailed reports after they mark papers. And they sort of flag up what most students struggle with, which can be really useful because if most students struggle with it, chances are you might make that mistake. So they miss important details in their questions and in the answers. And so basically little clues. A lot of times the exact phrasing of the question can really be a clue as to what you need to include in your answer. And of course, making sure that you include sufficient detail in your answer. It's obvious sometimes that the candidates didn't read the question properly. And there's a lot, I'm sure you've heard this a lot of times, read the question properly. But today we're going to really kind of dive into how do you do that? You need to have a strategy. Everyone can read. But we're going to talk about how you can make that consistent in your exam taking. And this is sort of like a more general point about how the exam is structured, which is, again, sort of quite useful insight for any exam taker. It's set so that it covers the specification as widely as possible and tests as many skills as possible. So this is something that's really useful to have in mind, especially sometimes when you're a little bit unsure of like maybe exactly what the question, just have that it's supposed to be a wide testing of many skills. So we're going to just start with an example of a question, and we're going to use it to demonstrate how we break down a question into its components and how that can really be a helpful strategy. So there are three things. We're going to be breaking down all questions today and throughout the day, actually, in three parts. One is what we call the context. And this is what's highlighted in green here. So it helps you to identify which part of the specification, basically which chapter do you need to think about and recall in order to answer the question. We then have what we call the command word, and we're going to look at several examples of these command words. Command words are actually also clearly spelled in your specifications, by the way, so it's really worth having a look at that, reading your specification properly if you haven't done so already. They'll tell you about the formats, the amount of detail, the approach to structuring your question. And then finally, the direction is going to tell you exactly what kind of information you need to include, and importantly, what kind of information you shouldn't include, what information is superfluous and a waste of time. So let's kind of break down the 7 different types of questions, really based on the command words that they come with. So we've got our state questions, which are usually quite brief. They're usually worth just the 1 mark. We've got our simple explanatory or descriptive question, which are going to be worth around 2 marks. Calculation questions, 2 to 3 marks, simple calculations usually. Then we've got our explanation or qualitative questions. So a little bit deeper than the simple explanatory questions, worth around 3 marks. Then we've got our experimental and data analysis questions, which are worth a little bit more, around 4 marks. And then we've got our extended responses, of course, or otherwise known as the 5-6 markers. And for AQA specifically only, we have the essay style questions, which are worth 25 marks. So we're going to go through each one of these now in a little bit more detail and give examples for each. So what are statement questions? They literally just test your recall ability. So, yes, they want to test your critical thinking skills, but they also want to test that you actually know and remember your material, your content. So these questions are going to be quite straightforward in the sense that they're not extra content or anything. They're going to be something that you've definitely been taught, something from your specification directly. There's going to be some context from which you'll need to sort of, it guides, which part of the specification you need to think about. And what are the command words going to look like? They're going to be state, define, name, give. So for instance, give two types of something, two types of proteins. Name the something. Which of the following, in the case of multiple choice questions mainly. Oh, sorry, let me just get the pen out. This is mainly for MCQs. Define the term. It's going to look something like that. So there'll be your command word and a little bit of context. Let's look at an example. So you're going to, and your answers are going to be quite short for these ones. You don't have to justify or explain. This will not only, spend quite a bit of time, which is very precious in an exam, but you might actually even lose marks if what you say is not exactly correct for what we call contradictory explanation. Of course, you have to make sure that you have a really good command of the appropriate key terms to use correctly. And so it's actually quite a good idea. You often have a glossary in your textbook, or you might have one from your school notes. And it's a really good idea for your definitions to just have them in a standardized phrasing. So you don't even have to think when you're writing them down, almost. You always think, of course, but. So let's see an example. There's a debate about the name of one species of snake, of one of these species of snake. Some scientists name it Liasis papuana, and other scientists name it Apodora papuana. Give the name of the taxon about which the scientists disagree. So sorry, I thought there was going to be something popping up. So let's break this question down before we see the answer. And let's break it down into context, command, and direction. So our context, I'll just try to really sort of stick to the color coding here to kind of help you throughout to begin to formulate that pattern in your head. So my context is the names of the snakes that the scientists disagree about. So context here. My command word, that's relatively simple to identify. My command word is give the name. So I know that it's a command word. So I know that it's a simple sort of, I also see the other clue that it's worth 1 mark. So I know I'm going to have to give a short answer. And finally, my direction is the taxon about which the scientists disagree. So this tells me exactly what my answer has to sort of center around, what the key information I need to include in my answer. So the answer is genus, the genus or the genera. Genus is singular and genera is plural because it's a Latin plural, because it's a Latin word. So I'm not going to, I just want to say that in this exam session, I'm not going to really be going into the sort of the reasoning and the justification why this answer is correct or not, because that's not the scope of this session. We're going to have plenty of chance to do that when we cover the individual chapters in the following sessions. So now we're just focusing on breaking down the question, literally on exam technique. Briefly though, here, we can see that the name of the genus basically is different between them, so they disagree about the genus. Right, so if I have a sort of definition type question, again, it's going to be a short sentence, maybe not just the 1 word, but it's going to be a short sentence or a bullet point answer. And again, it's worth memorizing, as I said before, with standard wording. So you don't have to sit there in the exam pondering about how to phrase something. And of course, you need to be as specific as possible. You need to make sure that you're utilizing all of the keywords that you've learned for that part of the specification. So, for instance, the effects of light intensity and temperature on the net primary productivity of young willow trees were investigated. State what is meant by the term net primary productivity. So, again, Same kind of technique. Let's break this down into the three parts that we've learned. What is my context? So my context is basically this entire first sentence here. So I know that I'm going to have to talk about the effect, context here. I know that I'm going to have to talk about the effect of light on basically photosynthesis and productivity. Sorry, I just forgot to mention one quick thing, which is that the answers to the questions, to the exam questions, will be sent to you, and I'll explain how exactly a little bit later in the session. So the booklets that you've got in front of you now don't have the answers, but you will receive them. So don't worry too much about writing down in detail every single exam model answer. The only thing that will not be sent to you and is not in your booklets are any sort of like hand-drawn annotations that I do on these exam questions or later in the diagrams in the presentation. So that might be the only thing that you want to be, if you want to be sort of jotting down as you follow the course. Anything that you see me writing by hand, you want to try and copy it as much as you can. And anything that is like a printed writing is going to be sent to you. So don't worry about writing all of that down. Okay. So, and if you've got colored pens next to you, do try to use that same kind of color pattern. It's really going to help your brain to get in that mode. So, context. I know what part of the specification I'm going to talk about. It's going to be photosynthesis and the effect of light. What is my command word? My command words, just switch colors to make it easier. My command word is that I'm going to have to state the term. That's exactly what I'm going to have to do. And finally, what is my direction? My direction is that I'm going to have to state the net, oops, sorry, I didn't change color, sorry about that. The term net primary productivity, that's what I have to define. So, and this is where we have a little bit of examiner wisdom. When you're asked to explain or define a scientific term, do not take words directly from the question stem because you don't demonstrate any additional knowledge to the examiner. It wastes time and it looks to the examiner like you're just trying to sort of fill the space. So don't do that. If we look at the answer, we just basically see a sort of very standard definition of what net primary productivity is. The rate at which plants convert light energy into the chemical energy stored in biomass in a given area in a given amount of time, minus the energy lost due to respiration. The definition itself is not what we're dealing with here in this session, but you see that it's a very sort of standard worded definition, appropriate use of keywords, and including enough detail. Okay, let's go into the simple explanatory or descriptive questions, which test your qualitative, as opposed to quantitative, understanding of biological phenomena, so the biological phenomena that you've been taught in your spec. You have to be able to recall some simple facts, but you also have to be able to kind of link them to your own knowledge and understanding, and also to be able to recall examples to sort of qualify whatever it is that you're explaining. They can be combined with a sort of statement question, sometimes in separate sub-questions. And the types of command words that you'll find in those questions are explain, describe, suggest, give reasons. So for instance, oh, sorry. Well, there was going to be something more popping up here, sorry. If we are looking at explain answers, basically you need to give a step-by-step logical reasoning to explain what is the underlying mechanism behind a biological phenomenon. So that could be listing off the steps of a biological process, for example, transcription or translation, or it could also be describing an observation, like for example, a food test, color change, and explaining why that color change occurs. So again, the context of the question here is super important. It's going to tell you which part of the spec you need to think about, and also how to justify, provide reasons or causes behind a particular phenomenon. Again, obviously don't repeat any content from the question. This is a really important instruction because often you might be a little bit sort of unsure about exactly what you need to include in the question. And whatever is included in the stem of the question is going to be a real guide, because basically, if you're in between two things that you have to say, whatever is in the question, you won't say. So there's never going to be a scenario where mentioning words from this question stem is going to give you any marks. So avoid doing that. Let's see an example. Dengue is a serious disease that is caused by a virus. The virus is carried from one person to another by a mosquito, Aedes aegypti. One method used to try to reduce transmission of this disease is the sterile insect technique. This involves releasing a large number of sterile male mosquitoes into the habitat. These males have been made infertile using radiation. Explain how using SIT could reduce transmission of dengue. So, again, let's break this down to our three things. What is our context? Just change color. So the whole step here is our context. This tells us that we're dealing with infectious diseases. That tells us that we're dealing with how infectious diseases are spread and the measures taken to mitigate their spread. Context. My, of course, command word here is explain. And my direction is going to be how the use of this technique, SIT, is going to reduce the transmission. So if we look at the answer, sterile mosquitoes could compete with fertile ones for food and resources, which is intraspecific competition. That's 1 mark. Since the sterile mosquitoes cannot breed, this reduces the total population of mosquitoes. That is 2 marks. So I have explained the underlying biological phenomenon, right? I have given a sort of step-by-step reasoning for what's the phenomenon here? The reduction in transmission of dengue. What is the underlying mechanism? The fact that mosquitoes cannot breed and they compete for resources, and therefore they finally reduce the population of mosquitoes. It's the underlying mechanism. It's just that this is a classic thing, like observation, explanation. My observation here is that the mosquitoes are reduced. What about describe questions? So to describe a process or a structure in context of a specific example. No explanation needed here, only describing in as much detail as you possibly can. And it can often be used for questions with experimental procedures. And it can be phrased as describe or sometimes outlined. So it will involve you describing the test, including the expected result. For example, describe 2 differences between the 2 images that could have been used to classify humans and chimpanzees in separate families. So the images, actually, let me see if they come up after. Yeah, okay. So these are the 2 images. We've got here a hand from a Homo sapiens and a hand from the troglodytes. And so figure 19.2 shows a human hand and a chimpanzee hand. Chimpanzees were once classified separately from humans. Humans and chimpanzees are currently classified in the same family. So the question here is, describe 2 differences between the 2 images that could have been used to classify humans and chimpanzees in separate families. Let's break this down as well. Our context is the differences between the 2 images, the human and chimpanzee. So that's my context. My command word is, of course, describe. command word, and my direction is how these images can be used to classify humans from chimpanzees. Direction here. So if we look at the answer, sorry, somehow the slide is not progressing. Give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. So what do we do in this question? The chimpanzee has a relatively shorter thumb. The chimpanzee has a longer palm, or the chimpanzee has wider fingers, or the chimpanzee has wider wrists. So what have we done here? We have just literally looked at the images, and we have just literally observed whatever differences we can see, and we've tried to include as much detail as possible. What about suggest questions? These can actually be a little bit more challenging because sometimes they may test you on something that is what we say unseen context. Sometimes your teachers refer to those as extra content questions. So they'll give you a sort of what they call an unfamiliar scenario. They'll present to you some kind of knowledge, and you will have to combine the knowledge and context that you already have from your specification to be able to kind of make a comment on what they're telling you. So you have to make it clear with your phrasing that you are actually referring to the context that's described in the question. And you have to, of course, give reasons for your answer. So suggest questions, it's almost like they've got like a little hidden explain word in there. And you have to also work out which concept is being applied. So basically identifying the context here and the part of this of your specification that you have to utilize to answer this is what can be a bit of a challenge. But let's see how we can develop an approach for it. So collagen is a protein produced by cells in joints, such as the knee. Rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disease. In an autoimmune disease, a person's immune system attacks its own cells. RA causes pain, swelling, and stiffness in the joints. Scientists have found a virus that produces a protein very similar to human collagen. Suggest how the immune response to this viral protein can result in the development of rheumatoid arthritis. So, again, same approach. Let's identify the context. Let's identify the command word. So the context is that, sorry, the context is actually quite large here, right? And it's also an unseen context. Yes, you've learned about, you've learned about some aspects of autoimmune disease, just a little bit, with small references. And you know what proteins are, you know what viruses are, like you can understand this question, but it's unseen context. You haven't learned, nowhere in your specification do you learn about rheumatoid arthritis. So this is the unseen context. So then let's look at our command word, which is of course the word suggest. And let's look at our direction, which is how the immune response of this viral protein can result in the development of rheumatoid arthritis. So let's look at the answer and see how the answer fits what we said. The antibody produced against this viral antigen will also bind to the collagen present in human joints, resulting in its destruction. So we have given an explanation, given a reason for our answer, and we have also used language that specifically refers to the context described in the question. So since we have been told that it's an autoimmune disease, we can use our knowledge of our specification, which says that, what does it mean that the immune system attacks? Oh, it means that it produces antibodies that attack the protein. Therefore, we can deduce that the viral protein will be attacked, much like the human protein. What about calculation questions? So we're going to go into the more data-based questions now. They, of course, test your quantitative understanding. They sometimes might need you to actually recall formulae, although a lot of times most formulae are actually given to you. So it's more about utilizing them than remembering them. You might have to interpret data sets that are given to you, such as figures, graphs, tables of numbers sometimes. And you have to sometimes do a little bit of a simple calculation, such as, an average or something like that, or percent increase, decrease, something like that. The types of command words that we're going to see are calculate, show you're working, or determine. And so you'll have to work out an actual numerical value using an equation that will either be provided in the question, or it's going to be something that you already know, like an average. You, of course, have to pay attention to the units and the number of significant figures in your answer. And if the number of significant figures are not stated, you're going to use similar figures as in the question itself. I can't stress enough how easy it is to make a mistake in unit conversions and lose marks like that. So be extra vigilant. You can determine some equations from the units that are given to you in the question sometimes. If the equation isn't given to you explicitly, you can work it out. Let's see an example. So different body fluids have different concentrations of different molecules. Calculate the order of magnitude by which concentration of copeptin in the feces is higher than the concentration of C-reactive protein in the saliva. Show you're working. So let's identify the different parts of the question again. We have the context here, which is that the body fluids have different concentrations of different molecules. So this is context. So this is the part of the specification that I'm going to think about. We have our command word, which is, of course, calculate. And also show you're working. And we can notice that we've got 2 available marks. So 1 mark will be for showing you're working and 1 mark will be for the correct answer. And we have our direction, which is, this is what we need to calculate, the order of magnitude by which one protein is higher than the other. Here we do have the units specified for us. However, sometimes they won't, and you have to make sure that you include the units yourself. Let's see the... Oh, sorry, no, we're not doing this one. Sorry, I forgot. We're not going to do the actual calculations because we don't have the data. So this is more for you to be able to understand how you approach the calculation questions. It's not important that we actually do the calculation. So, oh, sorry about that, guys. I have completely made a mistake here. I just looked at the wrong page. Sorry, no, we are doing the calculation. So this is the full question. Cirrhosis of the liver can result from long-term liver damage, and alcohol or other toxins can cause this damage. Scientists have suggested that cirrhosis can be detected by taking samples of body fluids. Oh, sorry, yes, we were meant to read this first. Sorry, guys, completely my bad. It's just the slides were a bit the wrong way around. So scientists suggest that cirrhosis can be detected by taking samples of body fluids and testing them for molecules C-reactive protein and copeptin. The liver produces those 2 molecules, and increased levels can indicate liver damage due to cirrhosis. Different body fluids from a patient suspected of having cirrhosis were tested for C-reactive protein and copeptin. And in this graph here, we've got the results. We've got C-reactive protein in the white bars, and we've got copeptin in the dark bars, and we've got the blood, saliva, urine, and feces, so different body fluids. The feces do contain some fluid. So the actual question is this bit that it's asking us. These different body fluids have different concentrations of these different molecules. Calculate the order of magnitude by which the concentration of copeptin, this one, in the feces here. So that's also part of my direction for this question, is higher than the concentration of the C-reactive protein in the saliva. So C-reactive protein in white in the saliva. So we're comparing basically these 2. So, and we have to show our working. So what I do here, it's relatively simple, right? Because all I need to do is read the values of the graph off of my y-axis. So one value is 10 to the 9th, the other value is 10. So to the first, so I divide one by the other to get the ratio, and this is my ratio. Sometimes it's really as simple as reading values of a graph. So don't be, for those of you that have a math fear and data fear, sometimes you don't actually need to do anything overly complicated with a graph. Sometimes just reading values off of it is pretty much all you need to do. Now, words of wisdom with regards to the calculation question specifically. Candidates should substitute the numerical values into an equation before rearranging or solving, as this can show correct use of the equation even if the final answer is incorrect. And because usually calculation questions might be worth anything between 2 to 4 marks, you'll get some marks for all of the showing you're working, even if you don't actually get the exact right answer, in the end. The answer line doesn't include the unit. You have to write your unit and the correct units next to your answer. And as I said, if it doesn't specify the number of significant figures, try to match whatever is in the question stem. All right, so explanation and qualitative questions. So the ones that are just a little bit more, we already talked about some of the simpler descriptive or explanation questions that are worth around 3 marks. Now we're going to go into ones that are worth a few more marks, that you have to go into a little bit more depth, which again test your qualitative understanding of biological phenomena. They'll test your ability to be able to describe and explain slightly more complex processes or formulate hypotheses based on information provided. They may even come at the end of a quantitative question. So, you might be asked to make some calculations, interpret some data, and then to be able to give a more in-depth explanation of what you're seeing. They'll be slightly longer. There may be multiple linked points. So, this biological phenomenon is due to this, which is due to this. There might be several sort of like layers that you need to go into. The command words are going to be similar to what we said before: explain, describe, outline, or comment. For instance, using your knowledge, explain this. They may sometimes say using your knowledge and the information in figure 1 or and the information in the graph. So they might actually explicitly tell you what you need to explain your answer. Explain why, analyze how, comment on. Let's look at the outline questions in a little bit more detail. And they can be a little bit similar to describe questions. However, outline as a command word definitely tells you that you, of course, need to use correct terminology. You can structure your answer in bullet points. In fact, I would say that you can always structure your answer in bullet points unless it's an extended response question where you are explicitly told that you get marks for clarity of expression of your answer. It helps the examiner, but it also helps you to be able to glance at your answer and assess whether you've addressed all the marks that the question is worth. Let's see an example. And again, as with describe questions, you don't need to give any explanation or justification for what you're saying. So ecologists investigated changes in grassland communities on large islands off the coast of Scotland between 1975 and 2010. On each island, they used data from a number of sites to determine the change in mean species richness and the change in mean index of diversity. Outline a method that the ecologists could have used to determine the plant species richness at one site. Let's break down the question into our 3 parts again. So my context is all of this. Context. So it tells me that I'm dealing with these concepts of my specification: species richness, index of diversity. My command word here is, of course, outline, and my direction is the method that the scientists can use to determine the species richness at one site. So only the species richness, right? I'm not going to talk about the index of diversity. That's kind of like superfluous information here. So the ecologists could have selected the various places to sample at random at the example at the site. At the site. Example, a map grid with coordinates selected using a random number generator. So here I'm explaining how they're going to sample at random. They could have placed the quadrant at these various randomly selected places. So I'm stating the equipment that I'm going to use. They could then have counted the number of different plant species present in each of the quadrants. So what exactly are they going to measure for that? So I know from my specification that species richness basically is the number of different plant species. And so that is what they're going to measure. So I'm just literally step by step describing how the study should be set up with specificity though. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the approach to outlining or describing experimental technique. Read your answer back and check if it fully answers the questions asked. And this is, this is a strategy for your exam anyway. Some students, and I think this is a good technique, you can make sure that you go through the entire paper, make sure that you don't run out of time, especially if you struggle with that you address all questions, and then use any time that you've got left in the end to go back and check your questions. And this is where structuring them in bullet point format is going to help you, because you can sort of easily assess whether you've addressed all marking points. Basically, go back and look at your answer as if you were an examiner, to the extent that this is possible, and say, okay, would that be a mark? Would that be a mark? What about the data analysis questions? So they, of course, test our experimental skills and how you apply them. And basically, all the data questions are unseen contexts, right? Because they're going to describe some kind of experiment that you definitely haven't done. You'll have the knowledge needed to understand the experiment outlines lent to you, and they will have some kind of resemblance to the sort of required practicals that you might have done. So it's not going to be that completely foreign to you, but it's unseen context. So they'll ask you to analyze and evaluate. We're going to talk about evaluate questions, specifically data and figures. And sometimes, so you'll get all the data and all the information that you're going to need in the context of the question. Sometimes some extraneous information, or like some teachers call these red herring. I don't know if how do you spell herring? I'm sorry if I misspell herring, guys. So something that tests your ability in being able to filter through the information given to you. Can you pick out the information that is relevant for your answer and leave out the information that is not? So command words for these are going to be describe, explain, summarize, analyze, deduce, compare, and contrast. But as it applies to data specifically. The describe and explain question are really common for data questions. And they are, 2 command words in one. They're going to be worth a few more marks. Describe and explain, not suggest. Right. So sorry, guys. I have a little note here which says that in your booklets, it may say describe and suggest here. But if you could please correct that on your end to describe and explain instead of suggest. If your booklets indeed are different, then please do that. So for the describe portion of the question, you're going to have to and we're going to see examples of that because it's a pretty standard technique how to describe data. You're going to look at the data and you're going to describe the sort of general trend that the data is showing. For instance, you've got a curve that increases and you're going to say, oh, this thing increases over this period of time, for example. But you also have to quote some relevant figures or values from the data in order to support the observation that you're making. We're going to see exactly what that means later. We'll see several of them, actually. And then you have to explain what the observation that you're making, the description that you're making of your data. Again, same kind of reasoning with explaining what is the underlying biological reason for what you're describing. And of course, you're going to use your knowledge, but the information too from the context of the question. I would probably say that a lot of students tend to miss out the information that the data is showing you. You might be tempted to use your own knowledge, and you might be missing some clues from the data. Okay, so let's actually go through a question like that, a quantitative question. An investigation was carried out to the effects of two plant growth substances, gibberellins and auxins, on apical dominance. The terminal or apical buds of a number of pea plants were removed and discarded. The tops of each of the remaining shoots were given one of the following treatments: coated with a paste containing gibberellin, coated with a paste containing auxin or IAA, coated with a paste in AQA they say IAA mainly, but it's the same. Coated with a paste without any plant growth substance. So just a paste with nothing in it. In addition, a control group of plants did not have their terminal buds removed and were not coated with paste. The growth of the side shoots was measured at regular intervals and a mean value was calculated, and these results are shown here in figure 6.1. Using the data from 6.1, describe and explain the effect of auxin on the growth of side shoots. Okay. Following our technique straight away, right? We are finding the context. The context here, and in data questions, the context is actually quite large. So all of that information, all of that background information on how the experiment has been set up, what are the dependent variables and dependent variables, what are the controls? Like, okay, here we can immediately identify that this is a control, right? And the information in the graph, all of it is context. My command word is, of course, describe and explain, right? So basically two command words in one, and they've got the end in bold, just to make sure. And my direction is, what am I going to describe and explain? I'm going to specifically describe the effect of auxin on the growth of side shoots. Auxin only, not gibberellin. So extra information that you're not going to use. Let's look at the answer. So the graph shows that there's no growth of side shoots up to day 8. So if we go to our graph here, we are looking at auxin. So we are looking at this line here with the crosses, this line here. So, sorry, this line down here. So there's no growth of side shoots up to day 8. That's one mark. And that is so this is the statement that describes what do the data generally show, right? Then between day 8 and 10, growth of side shoots occurs slowly and then grows faster up to day 13. So slowly between 8 and 10 here and more up to day 13. This is another mark and this is another observation. So these statements are just describing to me, but I'm also quoting some data, right? I'm specifically mentioning the days. The period of no growth occurs, and so that was my describe portion. So this up to here is my describe portion of the answer. Describe. And then for the explain, the period of no growth occurs. Why? Because auxin moves out of the paste and inhibits growth of the shoots. After 10 days, the auxin is all used up, so shoots start growing again. So after this point, I'm explaining this part of the curve. Okay, relatively straightforward with this one. Summarize. So present only the main points as the word suggests. You don't need to explain, you don't need reasoning or calculations. You do have to incorporate all of the data that is provided. State 3 conclusions that you can draw from the data in this table. So the command word here is not summarized, but basically I'm summarizing the data from a table that I'm going to show you in a minute. So this is the table. Small soil animals of 2 arthropod orders, mites and springtails, were studied in several areas of forest in Vancouver Island. Each of these areas was similar in slope and soil type. The study areas had different stages of tree growth. In each area, mites and springtails were extracted from soil samples and counted. The species of springtail in each were identified. And some species were not identified. Some of the data from the investigation are shown in the table below. So basically this table here is my context. I'm breaking down my question here. So this is also my context because it's explaining how the study was set up. And this is my context. This is the data that I'm going to have to look at and summarize. My command word is state. And my direction, what am I stating? What am I summarizing? 3 conclusions that you can draw from this data. That's my direction. So we're not going to go into actually the actual table and the actual data. We're focusing more on how to approach the question. So my answers are that the population of mites and springtails is much greater in the climax forest than in tree seedlings, young trees or mature trees. So, and you do that by literally looking at the data and making observations about the data. So, and kind of trying to get the conclusions that you can state about them. So the population of mites is greater in the climax forest, so basically here, rather than the tree seedling and young trees. Number 2, the number of species of springtail is the greatest in the climax community. So here, there is a greater population of mites than springtails in each sample. So I can see consistently throughout this column that there's always higher numbers of mites here than there are springtails. So straightforward, but you need to try and extract and interpret this data as much as possible. Compare and contrast questions. Also quite common questions. And really, I would say that they're your friend. They really, there's a real technique to them. And if you get it right, you can really achieve some really good marks with those. So you compare, and what you're comparing, it can be techniques, it can be processes, it can be biological processes. And you look at similarities and differences. You have to give a well-developed reasoning, as always, that is clear and logically structured. And you have to make sure that you show all of the relevant information to support the claims that you're making. Be really aware of whether the question is saying contrast only or compare and contrast. Often students miss the fact that compare means that you have to give both similarities and differences. You might be tempted to give only the differences. Similarities here. And sometimes if it says only compare, then again you have to give similarities and differences. If it says contrast, then that's easy because you only give differences. Let's see an example. So compare and contrast the effect of length of exposure to UVB on the chlorophyll and flavonoid content of these plants. So the plants that this question is referring to is this here. Sorry, I'm showing you the answer here. It's okay. So this is the data set that they're referring to. Scientists have investigated the effect of UVB on chlorophyll and flavonoid. A group of plants was exposed to UV for 20 minutes per day for 1 month. The chlorophyll and flavonoid content of each plant were then determined and the means calculated, and this was repeated for 3 months for more groups of plants. So we've basically got our data set here, and we're asked to compare and contrast. So first, similarities. Exposure to UVB for 20 minutes decreases both the mean chlorophyll content and the mean flavonoid content. So here I have a decrease here and I have a decrease here. That's 1 mark. Exposure to UVB for longer than 20 minutes causes the mean chlorophyll content to decrease and the mean flavonoid content to increase. So that's a similarity and that's a difference. Sorry, pressed something accidentally. And that's a difference. So here, one has decreased, one has increased. Exposure to UVB results in a greater change in the mean flavonoid content compared to the mean chlorophyll content. So I'm also comparing the actual changes, the qualitative changes. That's another difference here. Extended answer questions. So testing your ability to write and structure longer answers. And here you will have marks available for structure and coherence, for the quality of your phrasing, basically, including spelling. Don't forget spelling. And so, don't structure your answers in bullet points, full, well-phrased questions. They could even ask you to include some kind of diagram, especially if they're asking you to plan a sort of investigation. And the types of command words that we're going to find here are going to be evaluate or discuss. That is a pretty sort of classic one. Compare and contrast, explain, describe, devise, or design. Many students struggle with these questions, particularly involving some reasoning. I'm sure that many of you, when you're assessing your own strengths and weaknesses, I've never met a student that didn't feel that they needed some support and help with extended answer questions. Practice, 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 like with everything, but practice consciously with the technique that we're discussing here. So, evaluate and discuss. You're going to present key points from a range of arguments or the strengths and weaknesses of an argument. Considering more than one side, and you have to be relatively detailed about the arguments that you're presenting. Make sure not to confuse the word risks with disadvantages, especially when you're kind of like evaluating, like a study, for example, like a clinical trial. Let's see an example. So we've got this question here. Plant hormones affect the growth of plant tissues in different ways. One such effect is to promote the formation of seedless fruit. Cytokinins are a group of plant hormones. A commercial plant hormone firm carried out research into 3 different cytokinins: kinetin, zeatin, and dietin. The firm suggested that the effect of adding different volumes of each cytokine on the production of seedless fruit. The cytokinins were sprayed on the flowers of different plants, and over time, the mass of seedless fruits produced by the plants was measured. And we've got these figures here. So this is the effect of kinetin, this is the effect of zeatin and dietin. Mass of fruit, volume on the y-axis. So the question asks us, sorry, just one sec. The question asks us to evaluate. So what is the context of my question? On the basis of the results, the firm decided to use dietin in their new plant spray, and the firm made the following claim on their packaging: dietin is scientifically proven to cause production of seedless fruit when applied to flowers. This is my context. This is what I'm going to talk about, what I'm going to have to evoke from my knowledge. My command word, of course, is evaluate, and my direction is, what am I evaluating? I'm evaluating the claim using the evidence. So I'm told what I'm going to use for my answer. So if we look at the answer, the graph shows that the mass of the harvested seed. So evaluate, right? Giving what evidence from the figure supports the statement, and what evidence from the figure contrasts or doesn't really support the statement. The graph shows that the mass of the harvested seedless fruits increases as the volume of dieting applied is also increased. Fine, so I'm seeing a relationship between the chemical sprayed and the amount of fruit. That's in support of the claim. However, no error bars or statistical tests for the data have been provided, which means that the significance of the correlation cannot be quantified. This is against. And this is always a really classic mark whenever you're evaluating a scientific study and the claims made for it. Correlation doesn't equal causation. That's another mark. Furthermore, the lack of units and wrong labeling on the axes call the results into question. So we're questioning the validity of the results. That's an argument against. The species of plants studied and the concentration of dieting used are also not specified. So gaps and no control variables are used. So gaps in the validity of the study. Example, temperature, CO2 concentration are indicated. The virus, no control group is mentioned and no repeats are shown. Also, way more problems with the setup of the study. All of these factors mean that the claim made by the firm is largely scientifically invalid and unreliable. So in this particular case, there's only one argument for and several against. It doesn't mean that it's going to be like that everywhere. But also don't be afraid, if this is what the data is showing, don't feel that you have to give an equal number of arguments for and against. It's going to depend on the context that you're given. And here, this particular study seemed to be really poorly designed. So that's fine. That's what you're going to go for. Follow the evidence, follow the data that you're given, not what you expect. Device. So here we're going to have to explain, really kind of explain how we're going to set up an experimental study. We have to discuss any uncertainties, uncertainties in the equipment that we use to measure variables. We are going to have to specify our approach, the kind of apparatus that we're going to use. You can use a diagram to then also, or a graph to show the data that are going to come out of the study that you are describing. For example, let's see an example. Yeah. Okay. So the data for calculating metabolic rate are collected using a respirometer. The rate of respiration for small mammals can be measured using a continuous flow respirometer, and what it does is it circulates air through a chamber containing the animal. The rate of airflow can be measured using flow meters on the inlet and outlet tubes. Devise a procedure using a continuous flow respirometer to collect the data required to calculate the metabolic rate of an Arctic ground squirrel. 4 marks. So when guidelines for what you need to include in your answer when describing a study. Independent variables clearly stated, and not only stated, but how they are going to be measured. This is a mark often lost by many students, I would say. You will then also have to describe what needs to be controlled and how, if possible. So if you're talking about controlling the temperature or, the light exposure or the humidity, explain, if possible, how you're going to do that. And repeats, which is always a mark, on its own is not enough. You have to actually explain what you're going to do with the repeats. So are you going to take the average, or what are you going to do? Let's also now go ahead and break down the question in the 3 parts. So where is our context? All of this is the context. Sorry, sorry about that. So the context is the respirometer and how it works. The command word is to devise a procedure. And my direction is, what is the procedure going to be measuring? It's going to be measuring, calculating the metabolic rate of an Arctic ground squirrel, and I'm going to be using a flow respirometer, a continuous flow respirometer, to collect the data. Let's look at the answer together. Solution of potassium hydroxide must be used to absorb the carbon dioxide produced by respiration. This is almost a control. The volume of air entering and leaving the chamber through the inlet and the outlet tube has to be measured. So this is something that, how am I going to measure my variable? Because I'm told that I am looking at the, to collect. So how will I actually measure the volume of air and entering and exiting? Any decrease in the volume of air represents the oxygen taken up by the squirrel for respiration. So this is how I'm going to know, this is how I will measure how much air the live animal uses for respiration. Environmental variables, such as temperature, need to be controlled using water baths. So this is what I'm going to control, and this is how I'm going to control it using water baths. The measurements need to be taken for a few minutes. So this is also something that sometimes a lot of students miss. Specified amount of time for which you are running your experiment. And then the metabolic rate can be calculated by dividing the volume of oxygen used in a unit of time by the, so a unit of time means, you know, it can be minutes or it can be seconds, whatever sort of unit of time you decide, by the measured body mass of the squirrel. So here I'm also explaining how I will present the results, how I'll present or analyze the results of my study. So not only am I explaining how to set up the study, but also what am I going to do with the data in the end. Just running out of time a little bit. Finally, we have the essay questions for AQA only, which of course test your understanding and application in a holistic approach. So basically also your ability to combine information from different parts of your specification. There's usually going to be a lot of different points that you can mention in these questions, and it's not a challenge of whether you can think of every single one of them, but rather whether you can pick a few between 5 or 6 examples and write about a paragraph. So you have to go into a little bit of depth. You're not just kind of like listing things throughout your syllabus, throughout your specification. And you have to also make sure with your phrasing that you're always linking them back to the question, or to the key theme. It's not a humanities essay, it's not an English essay. You don't need an introduction or a conclusion. And of course, your appropriate use of the key terms of the terminology as much as you can. Their command words are going to be evaluating, contrasting, explain, discuss, describe, devise as well. They can actually be based. So as an example here, we have you know, like quite a brief mark scheme on the specific shapes of molecules, the importance of specific shapes of molecules in living organisms, a very wide topic. And if you notice here, there are just so many parts of the specification: proteins and enzyme, glucose and starch. So proteins and enzymes, as in like the shape and how they fit together. The plasma membrane in their transport, that they can have specificity, the immune response, antibodies, antigens, the shape of DNA and its role in polypeptide synthesis, hemoglobin and the shape changes that it undergoes when it loads oxygen or offloads oxygen, receptors for hormones and their specificity, a lot of things. So it's not a question of listing all of those without going into any depth. It's a question of picking a few, at least 4, ideally 6, and writing about a paragraph, right? So each paragraph of yours should be around 4 to 5 marks. And then you will have written even more than 25 marks. In literally 2 seconds, you have some tips about phrasing here. I'm not going to go through them in detail. I'm sure your teachers must have alerted you to some of those. So just common mistakes that we all do, you know, like energy produced whereas the correct is energy released, you know, semi-permeable as opposed to partially permeable. So common mistakes and how to correct them. Make a habit of this, because they can really cost you marks as well. And it's a shame, because, you know, you've done the hard part, you've structured your answer, and then it's just about being able to be specific with your use of keywords.